Hi, I'm Katie McKenna, and I did a project on Louis XIV and the evolution of theater in France in the 17th century. And I was really interested in doing this project because I took a CU Denver music appreciation class last semester, and my teacher kind of talked about this topic. So from the 400s to the 1700s, France was ruled by a true king. And I'm focusing on the time period of Louis XIV, who ruled from 1643 to 1715, and he was 4 years old when he became king. Prior to his reign, kings had significant power. Throughout history, the public and the nobility believed that God actually spoke through the king, so he was almost like a religious figure. What made Louis special was that he was focused on making an absolutist government, and all decisions were to be made by him. And he felt that he had to rule that way because of the civil wars of the Fronde that occurred during his childhood, where the nobility revolted against the royal family. It was a very traumatic time for him, so he wanted to make sure that he secured his kingship when he got older. So basically, he stripped power from all the French nobility so that they would be financially dependent on him. And he also used the arts, like theater, to make propaganda. It was in favor of him. And he used opera ballet, which was developed in Europe during the 17th century, and it was specifically intended for a noble or royal audience. And unlike the ballet that we're familiar with, the 17th century opera ballet used music, dance, spoken words, and pantomime to portray the king as the all-powerful rightful ruler of France. So I wanted to talk about a few of the ballets that were used as propaganda in favor of the king. And it's important to note that he actually danced in a lot of these ballets when he was younger. So one of those ballets was from 1656, and it was called the Ballet de Psyche. It was derived from Greek mythology, just like a number of the opera ballets were during that time. And Louis XIV was cast as the god Pluto. The playwright, Benserade, included a vers de personnage, which is a verbal interlude that alluded to the king's suspicions of disloyalty within his own court. And one portion of that vers de personnage states, "This abyss produces a great quantity of smoke. Hate, self-interest, ambition, self-love, I feel in my mind new problems, an internal war and secret combatants." And basically later in the plot, Pluto, which was Louis XIV, was shown to vanquish the darkness that existed in his royal court. So the whole play was basically a warning to his nobility to not revolt against him again like they did in the Fronde. Another ballet was called the Ballet de Muse from 1666. It portrayed Louis XIV's castle of Versailles as the capital of the arts, and it said that the Greek muses had abandoned this mythological place called Parnassus for Louis XIV's court. And then in 1669, the Ballet de Flore said that Louis XIV gave peace to all of Europe and he was respected by all the world. And symbolically, it showed Native Americans, Asians, and Europeans paying their respects to the fleur-de-lis, which was the symbol of Louis XIV and the Bourbon kings. So in order to keep the propaganda going so that the nobility would believe in the propagandic messages, Louis XIV needed to employ a lot of censorship. Censors ensured that no playwright wrote or performed a theatrical piece that satirized public figures, made personal attacks against the king, or insulted the Roman Catholic faith. And in general, current political issues were to be avoided. They were to be avoided because plays were not supposed to spark any political thought, because all politics were the responsibility of the king, not the nobility nor the public. So despite censorship, there were a bunch of playwrights who wanted to rebel against the laws that Louis XIV had set in place. They wanted to mostly insert their own speech into their works. And freedom of speech for the common person became more valued during the early to mid 1700s in a period called the Enlightenment. And the evolution of the plays under Louis XIV were great examples of how the values of the Enlightenment began to form. So a good first example where a playwright is kind of inserting his own speech is 1664's Tartuffe. This was a play by Molière, and the plot basically concerned the interference of a religious hypocrite named Tartuffe with the family he was staying with as a house guest. And the patriarch of this family, Orgon, placed so much blind faith in Tartuffe because he was convinced that Tartuffe was a devout Christian and could be trusted. Orgon was manipulated into signing all of his property and possessions over to Tartuffe. And the transaction never materialized because his sympathetic king voided the legal documents. Louis XIV didn't have a problem with this play, but the Roman Catholic Church did. They were insulted by the fact that the play alluded to the fact that there could be any sort of religious hypocrite ever. So it was banned from 1664 to 1669. So there's another interpretation of Tartuffe that I ran across when I was doing my research. And some scholars say that the plot could be interpreted as like a warning for Louis XIV against his pursuit of absolutist government, and in which it could be said that the king held a blind faith in, just like Orgon held a blind faith in Tartuffe. And it was only a king who could void Orgon's legal documents. So if Louis XIV failed in his devout pursuit of absolutism, who would save him? And scholars don't believe that Molière was seeking to overtly warn the king against his pursuit of absolutism, but it does provide sort of an implicit caution for him. So Molière exercised his freedom of speech in this play. Another Molière play was called the Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme from 1670. And here Molière depicts an audience of various social classes and nationalities competing for seats in a theater. And after the audience is settled, they watch the performance of a ballet, and when the ballet is at its conclusion, the entire audience begins singing a hymn, expressing their pleasure at having been able to see a ballet of quality meant for Louis XIV and his court, or for gods. After witnessing this work, the audience feels that their status has been elevated. And Molière intends to make the statement that because the public audience has seen a ballet fit for the king, they have basically assumed his status. So it's very interesting that Molière made a statement that alluded to social equality. And he really dared to voice his desire for the theater to serve the common man rather than only the king to the king himself. So he exercised his free speech again in Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme. And as far as Molière's fate, he fell out of favor soon after the performance of that play. So Molière died in the 1680s. So there was a kind of a whole new generation that was going to place their voices in the French theater. And these guys moved on to policy critiques. Jean-Louis Lully's Zephyr et Fleur was from 1688, and he portrayed Louis XIV as the god of the cruel north wind. And he was to be associated with darkness and hardship. And this policy critique was Lully protesting the excessive government spending on numerous wars in Europe, which was pushing France and its citizens into immense poverty and suffering. Now, Jean-Louis Lully's brother, Louis Lully, wrote Orphée in 1690. And here Louis XIV is cast as Pluto, and he's depicted as the enemy of the musician and hero Orpheus. And the setting was that Pluto was said to live in a palace surrounded by elaborate gardens, which matched the description of Louis XIV's Palace of Versailles. And the flames of Hades were said to burn behind Pluto's palace. And Pluto's ministers were said to be cruel, and hence Louis XIV is portrayed as essentially the devil, and his ministers are his evil henchmen. And in a particular scene, Orpheus performs music for Pluto and his wife, Persephone. And in that scene, Pluto mentions his plan to raise taxes so he can purchase the fuel needed to maintain the fires of hell. And the allegory of raising taxes is intended to be a criticism of Louis XIV's own action to raise taxes in France to pay for his wars in Europe. So as time went on from these playwrights, there became an ongoing tolerance for the critique of powerful political leaders. And it's a stark contrast to the political system of the 17th century, in which the people had no voice in governmental decisions. Le bourgeois gentilhomme advocated for the inclusion of the common people within the patronage of theater, and the Lully brothers introduced current political issues into the plots of their opera ballets. And their opera ballets were actually intended to be seen by the French people rather than the nobility. Now, the theater was certainly not the only place in which the Enlightenment revealed itself during the 17th century, but it certainly indicated and encouraged the rising will of the people. And in the end, the Enlightenment led to the overthrow of the French monarchy a century after Louis XIV's rule.